Hi, everyone, and welcome to today's webinar. We're going to go ahead and give it just another minute for everyone else to join before we go ahead and get started. All right. Hello, everyone. Thank you for joining us today for the Americans with Disabilities Act and Reasonable Accommodations for People with Disabilities webinar. This webinar is being held as a part of MOVA's Victim Rights Month commemoration, and we are thrilled to have Julia O'Leary here with us today from the Massachusetts Office on Disability. Before we get started, I'll go over some brief logistics. First and foremost, my name is Brenna Chase. My pronouns are she, her, and I'm the Director of Communications and Training at MOVA. First of all, this is a Zoom webinar, so that just means that you all cannot be seen or heard, but you should be able to see the presenters, the ASL interpreters, and the screen share presentation today. If you do have questions during today's session, we just ask that you use the Q&A function down at the bottom of your screen to ask them. All questions will be asked at the very end of the presentation. So if we do not get to them right away, hang tight and we will get to them at the end. We do have ASL interpretation and cart captioning available for today's session. To view those closed captions, if you go to the bottom of the screen and click on the up arrow next to closed caption, you should be able to choose show subtitle. If at any point you're having difficulty seeing the ASL interpreters or viewing those closed captions or any other tech issues, feel free to use the chat function and reach out to all panelists, and one of us will happily assist you. And with that, I will hand it over to Julia. Julia is the General Counsel for the Massachusetts Office on Disability. As General Counsel, Julia advises the agency on all legal matters and advises other Commonwealth agencies and municipalities on disability rights law, particularly ADA compliance. Thank you for being with us today, Julia.
Thanks, Brenna. And thanks to MOVA for having me present today. I'm really excited. I'm Julia O'Leary. As Brenna said, I am the General Counsel at Massachusetts Office on Disability. I use she, her pronouns. And as a visual description, I am a white woman with longish blonde hair, and I'm wearing a black blazer this afternoon. So we're going to talk about the Americans with Disabilities Act today, and talk about, what reasonable accommodations for people with disabilities are, and how you might apply those in your work. So go to the next slide. All right. Massachusetts Office on Disability is a state agency that serves as a resource to state agencies, to municipalities, and to members of the general public, like all of you, by providing information, guidance, and training on matters concerning disability-related civil rights, equal access, and opportunity. So if you or if any of your clients have a disability rights-related question, feel free to reach out to our office, and we can, provide you with some technical assistance and information. MOD serves as the ADA coordinator for the executive branch of state government. We're also a member of the Architectural Access Board. We administer a grant program to municipalities. We are a technical advisor to local commissions on disability. We also run the Client Assistance Program, which CAP, which is a federally funded program that provides support, advocacy, resources to people who are going through either the vocational rehabilitation process or who are seeking independent living services. So if you have clients who are involved in voc rehab or who are looking for independent living services and they need help navigating those two systems, they can contact our CAP team. And we also have a personal emergency preparedness program that does trainings for people with disabilities on how to be prepared for a variety of emergencies. People in the community really like this because if you are a person with a disability and you attend the training, you get a cool backpack full of emergency supplies. And that's pretty popular. We're also the state affiliate to the New England ADA Center, which is also a great resource for disability rights related issues. If you have questions about those, definitely you can also seek them out. I'm going to start the presentation today with an overview of the disability rights laws that kind of apply to you folks. I like to start on the federal side and then we'll touch on the Massachusetts side. We're really going to focus today on the Americans with Disabilities Act, which is a federal law and is really pretty similar to the Massachusetts laws. And we'll talk a little bit about where those are different. I am going to start my slide deck has section 504 of the Rehabilitation Act last on the list of federal laws, but I like to start there because it was the first federal legislation that guaranteed civil rights to people with disabilities. But it only applied in the context of federal programs and programs that receive federal funding. So if your agency receives federal funding, then section 504 of the Rehabilitation Act would apply to you. Section 504 prohibits discrimination on the basis of disability and requires that federal programs and federally funded programs be accessible to people with disabilities. And it introduces this concept of providing reasonable accommodations to people with disabilities in order to make those services or facilities accessible to them. About 20 years after the Rehabilitation Act was passed, we see Congress passed the Americans with Disabilities Act, which took the basic concepts of the rehab, section 504 of the Rehab Act, and applied them to more entities. So expanded who was covered by those non-discrimination provisions. The Americans with Disabilities Act applies to employers, it applies to state and local government services, it applies to places of public accommodation, it also applies in transportation and in telecommunications. So this is a really broad statute that prohibits discrimination on the basis of disability and requires programs and services and facilities to be accessible. And it also requires that covered entities make reasonable accommodations for people with disabilities in order to be able to access either their facilities or their services, just like Section 504 of the Rehab Act. We're going to focus on Title II and Title III today. Those cover state and local government services, including any vendors or contractors of state and local governments, and then places of public accommodation, which are sort of businesses that hold themselves open to the public. I also like to talk about the ADA Amendments Act of 2008. This is a really important act because prior to the passage of the ADA Amendments Act, courts had been narrowing the scope of the Americans with Disabilities Act from a couple of different angles. I mean, particularly the angle of who's covered as a person with a disability by the act, but also sort of what kinds of protections from discrimination the act provided. And what the ADA Amendments Act does is it tells us and it tells the courts that Congress intends for the ADA to be interpreted broadly. So when you're thinking about, how do I implement the ADA in my work, remember that this is, we want to be inclusive when we're thinking about the ADA and interpret it as broad, as a broadly as is appropriate. So that kind of should undergird your attitude towards the ADA. We're not trying to limit it here. We're trying to construe it as broadly as possible. On the Massachusetts side, protection against discrimination on the basis of disability is embedded in our Constitution in Article 114. What you need to know about that is that there are certain entities that may not be covered by the ADA because they're too small. And the Massachusetts Constitution in Article 114 is going to catch those. So it kind of closes that gap and makes sure that more entities are covered by the non-discrimination requirement. That article of the Constitution is enforceable through the Massachusetts Equal Rights Law. Massachusetts also has a public accommodations law that is similar to what you'll see in Title III of the Americans with Disabilities Act. It does provide a little bit more protection than Title III around sort of what the requirements are in place of public accommodation, but it's not so different that we're really going to talk about these differences today, because we're going to have kind of a higher level view today, but just it's something to be aware that it exists. It does impose some civil fines on violations, as does the service animal law, which is similar to the ADA in that it sort of says that you need to allow service animals in places of public accommodation, but again, it institutes a fine for violation. So I could just click. Okay. So as we get into what the ADA requires and what's required of you all as covered entities, it's really helpful to talk about what the term disability under the ADA means. And there's three categories of people who are fall under the disability definition in the ADA. The first category is what I call the actual disability category. And those are people who have a physical or mental impairment that substantially limits one or more major life activities of an individual. So that in and of itself kind of has three parts, right? First, you're going to look for what is the impairment this person has. Then you're going to ask, is it substantially limiting? And when we look at what's substantially limiting, we kind of look at the severity and the severity and the duration of the impairment. And then we're going to look at whether it is affecting a major life activity. A major life activity is either a major bodily function, so like breathing, immune function, digestion, or it is an activity that is of central importance to daily life. That's what the courts say. And that can be something like walking, it can be working, it can be communicating. This is a place where you actually will have a list in the ADA regs. So if you're curious for some examples of what a major life activity might be, you can look up the regulations to the ADA. Those are available on ada.gov. There isn't kind of a comprehensive list out there of what is considered a disability, and really disability is going to be evaluated on a case-by-case basis. But remember that the ADA Amendments Act wants you to be interpreting this this definition broadly. So when in doubt, kind of assume that someone is covered by the act because they're a person with a disability. If you're on the fence, err on the side of inclusion. People are also protected from discrimination under the ADA if they have a history of having a disability. So they may no longer have that impairment, but they used to, and you can't discriminate against them on the basis of that history of impairment. An example of that would be someone who's in remission from cancer. The cancer is no longer affecting them, no longer substantially limiting a major life activity, but they're still protected from discrimination based on that past history. You see that less in sort of government services and places of public accommodation. You see it a little bit more in employment, but it's important to keep in mind. It's also important to know that people who are regarded as having an impairment are also protected from discrimination on the basis of disability. So even if they don't have an actual disability, if people think that they do and discriminate against them because they think they have an impairment, that they are also protected by the Act. So an example of folks who might be sort of regarded as having an impairment would be someone who has facial scarring. They don't have an impairment that substantially limits a major life activity, their facial scarring doesn't affect how they sort of, their major bodily functions or how they live their lives, but they look visually different and they might be treated as being different, and that is prohibited under the Act. So these last two categories are protected from discrimination, but because they don't have an actual impairment, there isn't that obligation to provide a reasonable accommodation because there's no limitation to accommodate. So we'll talk about that a little bit more as we get into, what a reasonable accommodation is and how it works under the Act. The basic protections under the Act are this non-discrimination provision that I've been talking about. And non-discrimination is really any action, inaction, or different treatment because of an individual's disability. So if you are going to treat someone differently, particularly in a negative way, deny them services because of their disability, because of their status as a person with a disability, that is prohibited under the Act. The Act also includes in its definition of discrimination a failure to provide a reasonable accommodation when required. So what is a reasonable accommodation, right? A reasonable accommodation is any change in or exception to a policy or procedure that would allow an individual with a disability to have equal access in that setting. So that can take a variety of forms. It's always going to be based on a person's disability-related need, and it's always going to be provided on a case-by-case basis. So you can't sort of have a category, like a menu of reasonable accommodations, kind of a closed menu of reasonable accommodations that are available to people with specific types of disabilities. You need to be evaluating the appropriateness of a reasonable accommodation anew on a case-by-case basis every time that you're getting a request from an individual. Reasonable accommodations can take a lot of forms. One example of a reasonable accommodation is providing communication access, which we have here today in the form of ASL interpreters and a CART provider. So you can also have, more squishy accommodations, like maybe changing the due date for certain paperwork or providing someone with assistance in completing paperwork. When can you deny a request for reasonable accommodation? I like to get this out of the way because when I'm working with covered entities, it's usually one of their first. Am I on the wrong slide? Oh, yes. Okay, so sorry. What does disability discrimination look like? It's better. Disability discrimination can look like denying entry to a person because of their disability. So you say, you don't qualify for our program because of your disability. That would be disability discrimination. Another example of disability discrimination would be denying service, so service entry because of their disability. It can also be denying a request for reasonable accommodation because that's going to effectively deny them the service or the entry because they won't be able to effectively access your service or your facility. It can also mean denying entry to a service animal if the person with a disability relies on the service animal to be able to effectively use your space or use your service, access your service. Reasonable accommodation requests, as I said, are very broad. It's really any change that's necessary for a person with a disability to access your agency's programs or service because of their disability. So examples would be, as I said, communication aids or services like CART services or American Sign Language interpretation. For those of you who don't know, CART services are live real-time captioning services. So we have a live human being who is typing the captions as I speak. And that is a great form of communication access for lots of different types of people with lots of different types of disabilities. It could be great for people who are deaf or hard of hearing. It can be great for people who have attention-related disabilities, learning disabilities. It's a really great tool. American Sign Language interpreting is great. It's important to know that for some people who are deaf, they're going to speak ASL as their first language. And so it might not be appropriate to provide them with captioning as a reasonable accommodation because that captioning in English is going to be in a second language. So it might not be the most effective form of communication. And they really might need American Sign Language interpreting in order to have effective communication. So that's why it's so important to evaluate these accommodations on a case-by-case basis, because it's really going to be specific to the individual. Accommodations can also be removal of physical or architectural barriers. Maybe you need, maybe your facility doesn't have a ramp and someone needs a ramp in order to get in the door. Maybe they need a wider hallway or an accessible bathroom. It can also be reasonable modifications of policies, practices, and procedures. And this is where it gets really broad. That could be changing, as I said before, changing a filing deadline for paperwork, assisting someone with paperwork, giving someone, more time, allowing them to bring their service animal with them. It can take a lot of different forms, and that's where you're going to have room for creativity and problem solving, and why it's so important to do these things on a case-by-case basis. If you get a request for a reasonable accommodation from a client, make sure the organization has a process for how to deal with that. This is really important. I think something that sometimes organizations forget to organize or forget to clearly communicate to their staff. It's really important that you as an entity know how you're going to handle requests for reasonable accommodations so you can do so appropriately, professionally, and quickly. Organizations should have a designated person responsible for ADA and 504 compliance. This person is typically called an ADA or 504 coordinator. I'm going to call them ADA coordinators because that's what I'm used to. And this is the one person who should handle requests for reasonable accommodations in order to ensure that requests are responded to appropriately and consistently. You want an expert handling this because they need to understand what the ADA requirements are. They need to understand how to engage in the interactive process or dialogue, which we're going to talk about next. And they need to, have some ideas about what appropriate accommodations might be in different circumstances. So make sure that you have an ADA or 504 coordinator, that you know who they are and you know how to route requests for accommodations to them. Once that request has been made, the organization, through the ADA or 504 coordinator, needs to engage in what we call the interactive process or dialogue with the requester to determine whether the request is reasonable. This interactive dialogue is really the heart of the ADA, and it's trying to figure out how the person's functional limitation related to their disability is impeding their access to the facility, to the service, to the program, and what workarounds you guys can find together that will allow the person to appropriately access your program. Now, this is the part that I had jumped ahead to. When can you deny a reasonable accommodation request? Because people always want to know. The key word in the phrase reasonable accommodation is reasonable. This isn't intended to be so onerous that it is going to jeopardize the stability of an organization. So if the request would sort of fundamentally change how your organization operates, the service that your organization provides, we would call that a fundamental alteration, and that would be a basis for denying a reasonable accommodation request. You can also deny a reasonable accommodation request if it would constitute an undue financial or administrative burden. So if it's just you don't have the budget to implement this, you need to try, but if at the end of the day you cannot make those ends meet, you can deny a request for being an undue financial burden. Likewise, if a request would just be unworkable because you don't have the staff to support it, or it would be just too complex for your organization to manage, you can deny it. You can also deny a reasonable accommodation request if implementing it would cause a direct threat to either a member of your staff, to another client, or to the client themselves. And then finally, if the person who is making the request, is unable to articulate, really how their disability is affecting their ability to access your program, and they aren't able to show sort of the disability related need related to their request, then you can deny it sort of because they weren't able to provide the information that you needed in order to determine whether the request was reasonable. How to make your services accessible. So for the rest of my talk, we're going to talk about, what are all those words that I just say? What do I actually mean, practically speaking? What are you going to do? What can you take away from this presentation concretely to make sure that the services that you're providing to clients are accessible to people with disabilities, clients with disabilities? So the most important thing you can do as an organization is make sure that your clients know how to request reasonable accommodations. My suggestion is always to put this on your website really clearly so people know if they need a reasonable accommodation, this is the process for requesting one. Put it in your brochures if that's how people often find you. Make sure that you're making that information public and available so that folks who need to access your services but need an accommodation to do so know how to ask for an accommodation. Proactively offer communication access for meetings and events. if you're going to have an event that has a pretty wide audience, my suggestion is always to book both captioning services, so CART services and American Sign Language interpreting services as soon as you schedule the event, and let people know that they'll be available. If you are proactive about it, it's more likely that you'll have those services available on the day of, because they can be hard to book at the last minute. Make sure that when you're holding, when you're inviting clients into your office, if you're holding events, that your office space or your event space is accessible to people with disabilities. It follows, general architectural access guidelines, either the US Access Code or the Massachusetts Architectural Access Code. If you have questions about whether your facility is accessible, feel free to reach out to my office and we can kind of talk you through what the requirements are. If you have, a very specific question, we could even maybe do a site visit if that seems like it would be appropriate or necessary. So make sure that the space itself is accessible. And, on the opposite end of the spectrum, from sort of physical accessibility, try to cultivate a culture of flexibility and adaptability within your organization. The more tightly you cling to standard operating procedures, the harder it's going to be for you as an organization to feel comfortable with reasonable accommodation requests. Because, when you're not used to change or making, exceptions, making little deviations from standard operating procedure, it's really uncomfortable to do so. So cultivate a culture where it's okay to ask for what you need, and there's flexibility and adaptability on the part of the organization to make sure that those needs are met. And then my biggest thing is, after knowing how to request reasonable accommodation, is making sure that your website is accessible. We do so much online these days, and your website's often sort of your public face. So making sure that people with disabilities can actually access that public face is really key. We're going to do a little bit of a deep dive on effective communication, just because it's so important for people with disabilities, and making sure that they're able to effectively access the services that you're providing them. So for people who are deaf and hard of hearing, we talked about this a little bit earlier, they might require a CART, the live transcription services, or a sign language interpreter. They'll have a preference about which works best for them and which is going to be the most effective type of communication access for them. So make those determinations on a case-by-case basis. Know how to request an interpreter or a CART provider, and make sure that your agency's budget is accounting for the fact that you might need to hire them. Some people might prefer to communicate in writing rather than in verbal conversations. So they might prefer email to telephone or face-to-face meetings. That can be a reasonable accommodation request that's free for you. So definitely think about that, offer that, if that is going to work for someone. For people who are blind, make sure that written correspondence is accessible. So if you're sending a letter, make sure that there is an option to provide a digital copy that's in an accessible format. And we have a training on our YouTube about how to make, electronic documents accessible. So if that's something you're interested in, definitely check out our YouTube. If you go to YouTube, just search for Massachusetts Office on Disability and you'll find our page. So, make sure that your emails are in accessible formats, or your electronic documents are in accessible formats. And when I say that, I mostly mean are compatible with a screen reader or with keyboard only. Same goes for forms. We are seeing a lot of forms that agencies have people fill out that aren't accessible. So, definitely, check the accessibility of your forms. There are free online resources you can use if you just Google accessibility checker that will take a look at your documents and your forms and tell you, what the major issues are, if any. Provide large print or braille copies of documents upon request. If you, and have a plan for how you're going to do that ahead of time as an organization. So, you're probably not going to buy a braille printer, but you might want to identify a vendor that you could use that could print braille copies for you if you need them. If you're having a face-to-face meeting with someone who's blind, make sure that you announce when you are entering or leaving the room. This is a big one. There's, other etiquette tips as well, but that is really important because otherwise the person might not know that you are there or that you've left, and either of those is going to really hamper your ability to engage in effective communication with them. You don't want them continuing a conversation after you've left. For people who have cognitive disabilities, learning disabilities, traumatic brain injury, they might need more time to process information. So you might want to do what I should be doing, which is talk slowly and take pauses. People with cognitive learning disabilities, traumatic brain injury might benefit from CART. So you can always offer that, ask people if providing captioning would make it easier for them to engage in the meeting and follow what's going on. So those are just a couple ideas for a couple of disabilities. Obviously, the world of people with disabilities is much broader than that, as is the menu of possible accommodations that people might need. When we're thinking about website accessibility, which is one of my personal missions, is to get everyone to think about website accessibility. It's really important that you check your website periodically to make sure that it has basic accessibility features. So what are you looking for? Make sure that you have high contrast text. That means that you have dark text on a light background or light text on a dark background. You do not want to have medium text on a medium background because you want that contrast so that people can clearly read your content. It's also good to use sans serif font. That's font without the little feet on them. So an example of sans serif font would be Calibri or Arial. Serif font would be Times New Roman. It has those little feet on them. It's easier for people to read sans serif font, so choose that when you have an option. Make sure that any images that you have on your website have an alternative text so that if someone's using a screen reader, the screen reader will tell them what the text, what the image is. And this should be sort of brief and relevant description. So just like I gave a quick visual description at the beginning of this training, you can give a quick visual description. For the Massachusetts State Seal, we usually just say, Massachusetts State Seal. You don't have to sort of give a blow by blow unless every detail of that image is important. Make sure that your text is readable by a screen reader. It's really helpful to have headings when you're organizing text so that folks can easily navigate the page, and make sure that it's navigable by keyboard only. And like I said, there are free checkers that you can find just via Google that will do quick accessibility checks of your website. It's really helpful when you're thinking about web compliance to pick a standard and make sure your website complies with that standard. So we in the state use WCAG, which when we use WCAG 2.1, which is a web accessibility standard put out by WG3. And if you Google WCAG standards, you can get kind of an overview of what all those components are of web accessibility. So that's a good way to sort of pick a standard and make sure that you're meeting that standard. If you have a really complex website, if you have a lot of online forms, it can be really helpful to hire a vendor to conduct an accessibility audit. If you don't know where to start with that, you can check out on the mass.gov website. There is a statewide contract called ITS 61. And if you're, if you are able to make purchases off of statewide contracts, you could use that, or you could just look at what the vendors are that are on that contract, and they can do an audit for you and do remediation services for you to make your website accessible and any forms you have accessible, which is really important. And it's something that we've seen the Department of Justice looking at more and more in recent years. So we have time for questions, but before we get there, I have some resources for you. So a really great place to find guidance on the ADA is the Department of Justice's website, ada.gov. They have all of the regulations. They have great technical assistance documents. They have examples of past settlements. So if you're wondering how the DOJ is going to look at a particular issue, those settlements can be a great place to look at how it was handled before. In sort of communication access, I put a link here to the MCDHH, the Massachusetts Commission for the Deaf and Hard of Hearing website. They have a referral service for CART and ASL interpreters. That makes it pretty easy to request those services. And then on website accessibility, we have W3C, I said that wrong earlier, W3C's WCAG standards, which is really a helpful resource when you're thinking about your website. We also have DOJ finally issued guidance on web accessibility as it applies to Title II and Title III entities. And then we have this MOD best practices for hosting accessible virtual meetings to give you some guidance. If your organization has a lot of virtual meetings, it might be helpful to check that out. So with that, I will hand it over to questions if people have questions that they want to ask.
Thank you so much, Julia. We do have a question in the chat. You touched on the resource just now for website accessibility, but the question says, can you say more on website accessibility? Does this include social media as well? And what are some resources to ensure we're being accessible there?
Yeah, so social media, most of the platforms are going to have accessibility built in. It is helpful to if you're using, say, Twitter or Facebook, that you're using text instead of just relying purely on images. Instagram obviously is a really image-driven platform, but you can do image descriptions in the caption or as a comment. I would recommend doing an image description in the caption or as a comment if you're putting an image out on any of the platforms, so that you can have a quick description of what that image is. So if, sometimes people will just post an image of a brochure for an event, and that is not going to be accessible to someone who's using a screen reader. So copy the text of that brochure, put it in the caption, or put it as a comment so that folks can access it. But if you're using Twitter, instead of posting the image, just post the words, because that's going to be more accessible to more people. You can post the image too if you're really committed to it, but I know there's a split between people who like images and who like words. So, but make sure you're always including the full text. That would be my biggest pointer for social media accessibility. And there's more on social media accessibility on W3C's website. So definitely check that out as well.
Awesome, thank you. Another question. Does language access or translation services fall under any of these laws?
So language access in the context of disability, yes. Language access in the context of foreign languages, no, unless someone is, not a native English speaker. And so, well, no, not really. That would be more Title VII. So no, this is really about when you need communication access because of your disability, you would have communication access obligations under the ADA. If you need communication access because of, because you speak a different language, that would be Title VII, not ADA.
Thank you. If you are unable to meet an accommodation request for whatever reason, what is an appropriate way to message to the person who submitted that request that you are not able to meet their request?
I would do it in writing so that you have a record of it. And I would explain what reason you're using of those reasons that I talked about. And I'd try to provide as much detail and context as possible. So if it would be too expensive to implement, say so. This would cost $20,000 and our agency's budget is only $2 million, and it's just not something that we can afford right now in order, to make sure we're providing the rest of our services. Or if it's administratively, you're saying it would be an undue administrative burden, you might explain why it's not administratively possible to implement that. If it would be a direct threat, you could say that, right? We can't allow you to bring your service animal because the last time that you did, it bit someone. And so that poses a direct threat to our staff and our other clients. And so we're saying no. But I would do it in writing and try to explain the rationale.
Thank you so much for that. And then another question, is there a virtual meeting platform that works best for accommodations or accessibility?
So because I am a state employee, I can't endorse a specific platform, but I can tell you that different platforms have different features, and you should know what those features are. And if you Google it, you can kind of compare those features. So things that you want to look for on a platform: are you able to spotlight or pin someone's video screen. So today we have our ASL interpreters and me and Brenna spotlit and pinned so that you can see us at all times. So it's really important that you're able to spotlight the ASL interpreter so that their screen is going to show up at all times. You're going to want to think about how captions integrate into the video platform. So are you going to use a separate link so that people will look at the captions on a separate, in a separate window, or are you able to stream the captions at the bottom of the screen? How does that integrate? Zoom actually has this really cool feature now where we're not using it today because not everybody has it and your interpreters have to have it, but you can actually, if you are using the ASL interpreter, you can pop their screen out and move it around and change the size of it. And that's really helpful, but everyone has to have the latest version of Zoom for that to work. So that doesn't always, that's not always possible, but that's a cool feature that they just rolled out in the last 6 months that I've never actually implemented because we never have everybody with the right technology on board. But those are some things to think about. And some platforms are just more cumbersome to use. The disability community is pretty vocal about which ones they prefer. If you're providing a web meeting as a reasonable accommodation, you could always ask the person who's asked for the web meeting if they have a platform, and then you can figure out if that's one that you can use, and you can kind of negotiate which one. But most of them are providing basic accessibility features now. Some of them weren't earlier. In the last 3 years, we've seen a lot of improvement in the accessibility of web platforms. So sorry, I can't give you a brand name, but those are some things you could think about.
No, that is great. And we know that all of these platforms are evolving constantly. So you taught me something new. I wasn't aware of that new feature for Zoom. So that's really great. I am not seeing any more questions in the Q&A right now, but I welcome people to keep dropping them. While we are waiting, I will just thank you, Julia, for all of this important information. We're really grateful for your time today and for your office, and that your office and you can be a resource to us to ensure we're meeting ADA compliance and being more accessible in all that we do. So thank you very much. Like I said, I welcome any other questions, but as we wrap up, I will just say that we have quite a few webinars happening over the next couple of weeks. We welcome you to join us again for some of those if you're able to. I believe Charlotte dropped some information in the chat just now that includes a feedback form and a link to additional resources for the victim services community. And with that, not seeing any other questions, I think maybe we can give everyone a few minutes back of their day. Thank you again, Julia. We really, really appreciate you. And thank you to our ASL interpreters and CART provider who are with us today as well, and to everyone in the audience for your participation and for joining us. I wish you all well. Take care.
Thanks, Fran. Thank you to Nova for having us.